Okay, so hi Benji, thank you for joining us. So can you tell us a bit about who you are and why have you written your book?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Benji Waterhouse. Now a consultant psychiatrist, and I've written a book called "You Don't Have to Be Mad to Work Here," which really looks to kind of unlock the doors to the psych ward. It's a kind of fly on the padded wall account of NHS psychiatry that also looks to bust some myths like there aren't really any padded walls. And the reason I wrote it was there is a very welcome mental health conversation now, which is kind of great, but it does tend to focus at the mild and more palatable end of the mental health spectrum. And I wanted to give a voice to people with more serious mental illness, things like schizophrenia, the people I work with who tend to often be left out of the mental health conversation. And they're those ones for whom some mindful colouring in and cold water swimming probably won't do much and are actually the most disabled people in society.
Yeah. And what were the kind of harshest lessons you learned in your early days as a psychiatrist?
Well, I had a very rude awakening because I remember at my medical school interview, one of the questions was, how did I want to change the world? And people were thinking in these very grand terms. And of course, you only go into these, well, you're partly motivated to go into medicine, I think, because you want to help people. And as trite as I know that sounds. But then I remember when I first arrived, one of my early bosses, we were seeing someone who was thinking of jumping out of her bedroom window, and my boss discharged her because her flat was only on the second floor. And when I first signed up, I had no idea that I would be allocating these limited resources essentially based on whether jumping from a certain floor flat would create a big enough splat. But unfortunately, the state of mental health services being what they are, being so limited, the way you do have to triage everything, that sort of thing, disturbing as it sounds, very much comes into the kind of mental calculations that you have to do.
Mm. Mm. And what were some of the myths and misconceptions around psychiatry that you were hoping to bust with your book?
Um, well, there are, at the most basic selfish level, I suppose I thought it would be quite helpful to explain to people the difference between a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a psychic. People seem to get quite confused about that. I tend to think psychiatrists tend to dig up stuff from your past and psychics more from the future. But, and I suppose mainly though, I really wanted to bust there are lots of myths about patients, really. Um, especially things like people, as I say, people with schizophrenia about their levels of dangerousness, and I think the way they're depicted is usually in horror films or in true crime dramas or on the front of tabloid newspapers on the rare occasion that something goes wrong. You know, most recently, I suppose, what happened in Nottingham, tragically. Um, but I think it's important to remember, and I wanted to get this message across in the book, that most people with schizophrenia will never be violent and are actually more likely to be victims of violence. And things like alcohol and drugs are a far bigger risk factor for homicide than schizophrenia is. So technically, I'm safer in a psychiatric patient's home than I am at a psychiatrist's house party.
Nice. I mean, schizophrenia, obviously, yeah, it's like an unpopular diagnosis with a lot of stigma attached, as you raise. I mean, what's your
Mm.
position broadly on diagnoses?
Well, I don't really have like a fixed position, I suppose there are kind of arguments on both sides. Some people find a diagnosis very validating. It helps to explain the way, that the issues that they have in their life and kind of legitimizes those problems in a way that some people find really helpful. I suppose the flip side of it is that they can also, it's important to remember that psychiatry is not a hard science. And if you present the same person in front of 10 different psychiatrists, you could leave with 10 different diagnoses. So their validity is kind of quite flimsy, really. And so my suggestion, I always think it's better to hold these concepts more lightly. And we hear people talking about my ADHD or my depression or this or that. And the problem is if it becomes so attached to your identity, I think there's a risk it can kind of put a full stop on things. and stop people being more curious about other things in their life that might be contributing to some of their problems. And as you say, at the most extreme end, I can see some labels are just actively harmful. Something as stigmatized as schizophrenia, sometimes someone being labeled with that term, society's reaction to that person, the way that we'll kind of, these are, I suppose, are the people that we kind of might, move away from if they're kind of talking to themselves on the bus. Those people like to keep a distance from. Having as stigmatized a label as schizophrenia means that often friends, family, partners, society will leave those people, and so that the effects of the label can be as disabling as the condition itself. And I've got a story in the book about when I was seeing a lovely gentleman who had a schizophrenia diagnosis, but who was very kind of lonely and just kind of potted around on his own. And I was the only person he saw regularly. He only saw me every 6 months at his clinic appointment. And on one occasion, at the end of an appointment, I asked if he wanted me to increase the medicine to kind of try and quieten the voices a bit. And he said, no, thanks. He said, some of the voices are all right. And besides, they keep me company.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, one of the things I feel like you tackle in the book is around medication. There's a thread about medication throughout, and it feels like public understanding of medication isn't necessarily up to date in terms of their effectiveness. I mean, is that true? And what is the latest thinking?
Oh, sorry. Well, certainly, as always happens in medicine and science, old ideas are kind of replaced with newer ones, as kind of new evidence comes out. And I think I was taught at medical school this very biological, simplistic, convenient model that depression was caused by low serotonin in the brain. It was just a chemical imbalance that needed correcting with a SSRI antidepressant, right? And but now only, and it's an interest, obviously, pharmaceutical companies enthusiastically embrace that narrative to the extent that now it's thought 80 to 90% of the general public believe, depression to be caused by low serotonin. But at the most recent meta-analysis, which was done, which is like the highest level of research, where you get together all the randomized controlled trials that look for evidence of this, that found that there's actually no evidence for any of that, and so we're slightly back to square one, really. And I think that mechanism didn't quite make sense to me, because I was seeing it in front of me, my patients. I'd be prescribing these things and they wouldn't be getting better. So if it was literally as straightforward as, say, insulin control in diabetes, why would that be? You wouldn't expect to see that. But antidepressants don't work for like 30 to 50% of people, which suggests that maybe it's not quite as straightforward as that model suggested. Yeah, and I think people are starting to become a little bit, the evidence base for antidepressants has always been a little bit underwhelming. The evidence shows that they're only marginally superior to a placebo. And I suppose you have to bear in mind as well, those are just the studies that weren't burned because they didn't show any kind of benefit at all, So I think society is starting to be a bit wise to this, and now even NICE guidelines are changing to kind of shift a little bit more away from this model of just throwing antidepressants at everything, because we've got more people on them than ever before, and yet society is more disabled than ever, which kind of doesn't really fit for a drug that works particularly well, does it? And I think that's why there is now a welcome move, certainly at the milder to more moderate end, to move into more kind of social prescribing. And there's good evidence that things like gardening are as effective for depression as Prozac is.
Thank you. And I mean, on the non-medical model, you seemed surprised to be recommended to go into therapy as you worked your way up the ranks in psychiatry. I was curious about that, and whether it wasn't standard practice, and also what your experience of therapy was like.
Well, I suppose Western psychiatry has kind of this very biological identity of being with the doctors in the white coats that prescribe the drugs, And so there is often a big split between psychiatry and psychology, you know, which often to me seems a little bit more thoughtful. And so, yeah, there are plenty of psychiatrists who don't have psychotherapy or psychology themselves, but we are encouraged to have it. So yeah, I did have it partly because, you know, psychiatrists have notoriously poor mental health themselves. And yeah, my experience of therapy was good. I did psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is, you know, that's when you just have, like, I suppose, traditional psychoanalysis, but just only once a week. And it's like where I would just like lie on the couch and free associate and talk about my childhood, I guess. And like he would listen out for slips of the tongue, like when you say one thing but you mean your mother. And then he was great, my therapist, Joseph. Like he was like really, his hands though, they never, like, when he spoke, his hands never came apart as though he'd been involved in some sort of super glue accident. And he was like really old and wise, and he taught me so much. But the only slight catch with being old and wise was that he would also sometimes fall asleep. But he'd always like apologize afterwards. I remember once he said to me, "Yeah, Benji, I'm sorry about dozing off that time you were talking about your anxiety about being boring company." Yeah. But he was great. Like he taught me loads, but I don't necessarily, as with everything, I don't think anything is kind of the magic bullet. You know, there are limitations to psychology and psychotherapy, of course, as well. And, you know, sometimes I think they can be very informative, you know, and give you nice, help you to intellectualize stuff or make sense of stuff. For me personally, I'm not sure how transformative it has been, you know, how much it's made me feel particularly different, but I think there's value in at least having the insights. And certainly I would say to my three little brothers, because I suppose we had a slightly complicated upbringing, and I would sometimes say to my little brothers, recommend that they have therapy too. And they'd say to me, "No, thanks, Benj, like you're the only one that has it and you're the most unhappy, no offense." And there is something in that, in about like, how helpful is it digging up this old stuff and going over it all over again, you know, and sort of arguably living in the past, whereas now, you know, I suppose through the rise of more mindfulness and kind of Buddhist like approaches, people are maybe thinking maybe better just to try and be in the moment.
It sounds like you had a relatively kind of traditional form of therapy as well. Maybe it's worth
I
saying.
did. I think it doesn't really
Quite
come more
old
traditional
school in
than
a
psychoanalysis.
old
Yeah,
school in
yeah,
a way.
exactly. Well, that is,
Yeah.
Freud was old school, wasn't he? Yeah.
But no, that's really interesting. Thank you. I mean, you have been really honest about your childhood, your family upbringing, and I mean, what's that been like as a person, as a psychiatrist, as a writer, as a member of your family? I imagine it's been complicated.
It's been, you know, it's been great for me because you know, I find writing really helps me to organize my thoughts and what I feel about stuff, and it is really cathartic, isn't it? I suppose in the same way that therapy is, in that you kind of get this, you can get this stuff off your chest, kind of thing, and so I think it's been liberating and freeing for me as well, especially considering. But I have to be mindful that, you know, my family necessarily haven't found it quite so straightforward because I'm from this slightly more modern, you know, generation who like to share, arguably sometimes overshare about these things. You know, whereas my parents, my mum especially, are from the more kind of traditional British stiff upper lip, you know, just pretend everything is fine. And so this idea is more novel and more unsettling for her. So that's been a bit of a journey, kind of working through all of that, you know, because like when I first got, what I need to say is like, despite the kind of issues that I had growing up, like me and my brothers were so lucky because we at least had that really strong foundation of love, of being loved and knowing we were loved. And that has never, ever been in question. And that's kind of the most important thing, isn't it? But I remember I did still want to talk about the other things that I found difficult, I suppose, those themes being maybe, you know, growing up around alcoholism and, you know, domestic violence and suicidal sort of feelings sometimes, not in me, but in my parents, and trying to manage all of that. And yeah, it was interesting because when I first got the book deal, like my mum went and like proudly told all of her friends, and I was like, maybe wait until you've read the book first, mum, you know, and like, I don't think she quite expected that I was going to kind of talk about this stuff. And she's been on a real journey because, you know, there were times when she didn't want to sign it off and kind of give me the blessing to do it. But I think now, hopefully, she's come out the other side and realized that the world doesn't end by talking about these things. And actually, it can be quite freeing and liberating. And hopefully, it can enable her to have the sorts of conversations that she's never dared have herself, you know, while she's just been keeping all this stuff to herself.
Yeah, and do you have any apprehensions about how it's going to change your work as a psychiatrist if you think about people reading the book?
Um,
Not that you should. I'm just curious.
yeah, I certainly hope not. I mean, like, you know, psychiatrists are always taught not to give personal
Yeah.
disclosures, you know. But again, I think that's a very traditional way of working, and that seems it always seemed really unfair to me that I was allowed to ask about, you know, their most intimate things, to even to the extent like I was allowed to, you know, ask them what they would like, you know, masturbate to or fantasize about. And yet if they asked me where my accent was from, I was supposed to say, oh, this isn't really about me, let's get back to the psychiatric interview. It seems so robotic, you know, and not helpful for the therapeutic relationship. So I think there is something, of course it's important to maintain boundaries, but I hope that it's also kind of helpful to show that, you know, doctors are obviously humans too. And yeah, well, yeah, yeah. I hope that it would have a helpful effect, not an unhelpful one.
Yeah.
But where I work in emergency psychiatry, I think hopefully, touch wood, it shouldn't be too much of a problem because I tend to be working just covering multiple. The job I've been doing for the last 6 months anyway is as a consultant psychiatrist covering like the emergency psychiatry kind of department, just covering like multiple A&Es, and that job really just involves cycling around to different A&Es, seeing people in crisis when they're really, really, really unwell, and then inevitably, sadly, having to section them. And at that sort of stage, people are so disconnected from reality and unwell, they're not really reading books or kind of worrying about stuff like that. So
Yeah, sure.
yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
And I mean, you mentioned psychiatrists have kind of there's a stereotype of them having poor mental health. And you also met when you were talking about your parents, you said, you know, that you were managing things. And I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on, you know, what chicken and egg. Is it the impact of psychiatry, working as a psychiatrist, that is so harmful to mental health, or are people who are drawn to this kind of work, they're coming from a place where they've had experiences anyway?
Yeah, that's a good thought, isn't it? I mean, there was some really interesting research done um, by someone called Jenny Cousins in the BMJ, I think, a few years ago, and it looked at it served, and it basically it looked at the well-being of medical students, and it found that medical students wanting to go into psychiatry were already more depressive than medical students wanting to go into other medical specialities like surgery or whatever. So I think it does inherently attract maybe slightly troubled souls for whatever reason. And then probably being around human misery in your day job probably doesn't help much because that stuff can kind of stick to you.
Well, how do you take care of yourself then? What are your ways of staying sane?
Well, it's not rocket science, you know, people always, I suppose that's the thing. It sounds always super, and often the answers, I think, in psychiatry are a lot less medical and sophisticated than we might think. And I'm kind of slightly overqualified to kind of to give them really, you know, in terms of how the years I've done in training and medical school and all the rest of it. Like, you know, so often sleep is like a miracle cure for mania, and exercise is a wonder drug for depression, and like people's suicidality can be instantly cured by getting back with their ex, you know. And for me, people often they ask me so often, you know, what's the secret to happiness? That like I've got my response down to a fine pattern. I usually say, oh, you know, it's dead simple. Like all you need is a healthy birth, secure attachment, happy childhood, no trauma, high resilience, loving friends, family, and partner, fulfilling work, financial security, manageable targets, 8 hours sleep, regular exercise, healthy diet,
Please.
moderate drugs, alcohol, and social media, plus or minus antidepressants, therapy, and 100% charge on your phone.
Nice.
and that should cover it. And that's what I try to do.
Simple.
It's just that simple.
Nice. And
But we're not holding back any secrets. We're not holding back any
no,
secrets
no.
here.
No, I was just curious about yourself. Um,
For me, yeah, I find, working full-time psychiatry was definitely not good for my mental health, Um, certainly when I was trying to do nice things like this, like writing a book, and I now have nice jobs like having to write the TV adaptation of the book and things like that, and writing a second book. So I just couldn't do all those things and stay well. So I now work part-time, and that works well for me, albeit I'm left with a bit of guilt because I know there aren't enough psychiatrists as it is. But the way I like to think about it is that probably better to have a happy, not burnt out psychiatrist than a burnt out full-time one, And so yeah, I get a creative fix, which is nice, and hopefully there's some value in this sort of work, hopefully, in trying to get out some positive messages anyway. And then the usual things like, I play a lot of football, I try to exercise, try not to drink too much, try to see friends and family, and yeah.
Thank you. And so if the model is limited, the medical model, I mean, are there examples elsewhere in the world where they might be doing it better? And what would you like to see happen in the UK?
Yeah, well, yeah, the medical, human misery is a bit of a clunky fit within the medical model, isn't it? And I think, at medical school, we were always taught this biopsychosocial model, but with kind of services, people just being so short of time and the absence of kind of power to change people's social circumstances or any psychologists to refer them to for psychological work. That often in NHS psychiatry, it feels like we're working under a very bio model. And that feels kind of super limited to me when I'm there just playing around with, a person's 12th different antidepressant, hoping that will be the thing that might make everything fine, whilst totally neglecting, the social drivers of human misery in their life, like their crap housing or their abusive relationship or their, whatever it is, the poverty or their lack of opportunity or purpose or job prospects or whatever these things are, And I don't know, Scandinavia seems to be quite revolutionary and certainly trying to do things a slightly more thoughtful way, I think. And certainly for more serious mental illness in Scandinavia, they're doing kind of this thing called like open dialogue, which is where um, you promote more patient autonomy. So, for example, like in Norway, for example, patients they can decide whether they want to take antipsychotics or not. And then if they don't, that doesn't automatically just mean that their psychiatrist threatens to section them if they don't. And then if they don't, they section them and then they're backlogged in psychiatric hospitals and forcibly, medicated and all the rest of it. And then they come out and then we just have that whole continuing cycle, which is how we work here. Instead, they kind of don't get so preoccupied with the drugs and instead will invest all that energy into other stuff like supporting them in their homes or like with their neighbors or their families and trying to tie up all of those other things, And amazingly, they've had incredible outcomes in kind of reducing readmissions and kind of increasing the rate at which people return to work, even under this less coercive, less paternalistic model. And that seems a much kinder way to practice. I certainly don't, sometimes when I'm sectioning people, restricting them of their liberty, and then writing them up for medications that they're going to have to be forced, physically restrained for and forcibly injected with, you sometimes wonder if I'm on the right side of history, really, because that's sort of not, it doesn't feel, sometimes it just doesn't feel very nice. Sometimes you worry if that's, barbaric, I suppose. And if there's a kinder, more compassionate, more thoughtful, and also more effective way of doing things.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for your time, Benji. It was a real pleasure speaking to you and hearing your insights. And the book is great, so I'm sure it will do really well.
Oh, bless you. Thank you, Alice. Nice talking to you.
Lovely to talk to you, Benji. Take care.
See you. Bye.